Welcome to the Religious Studies Project, brought to you in association with the British Association for the Study of Religions and the North American Association for the Study of Religion. I'm Christopher Cotter, and
I'm David Robertson, and our interview this week is by Breann Fallon, and it's with our good friend Jack Tsonis on the subject of the Axial Age. And I'm sure Jack's got plenty to say, so let's just pass straight over.
Karl Jaspers created the term Axial Age in 1949, after considering that the Bhagavad Gita, the Pali Canon, the Book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, the writings of Plato and Aristotle, the Daodejing and the Analects of Confucius were just a few of the philosophical and theological texts penned in the middle centuries of the first millennium BCE. For Jaspers, this collection of philosophical and theological works was a sign of an era of social maturity, a maturation that Jasper felt left simpler formulations of such thinking in its wake. To discuss the Axial Age, its consequences, credibility and critiques, we are joined by a long-time team member of the Religious Studies Project, Dr. Jack Tsonis. Thanks very much for joining us today, Jack.
Thanks, Breann. It's nice to be here.
Dr. Jack Tsonis completed his doctorate in 2013 at Macquarie University in Sydney. After tutoring in the areas of sociology, psychology and European history, Jack has recently taken up a position at Western Sydney University, teaching the Masters of Research program. Jack's wide range of research interests include post-colonial theory, discourse analysis, micro and macro level social theory, the politics of memory and saunitarianism. Jack is in fact the founder of the global saunitarian movement and the founding president of the Australian Sweatbathing Association. So before we dive into your work on the Axial Age, I think it would be beneficial for us if you give a general introduction and historiography of the Axial Age, as it has really grown and changed from Jasper's original manifestation.
Yeah, that's right. It has changed a lot. Jaspers was basically the first person to use the term Axial Age. The idea wasn't uniquely his. Basically, it refers to the period, as you sort of alluded to in the introduction, roughly from 800 to 200 is the dates that they give, BCE, which saw the rise of the so-called world religions across Greece, Israel, India, and China. Sometimes Persia and Zoroaster is included in that as an early sort of glimmering. And the basic characteristics are that these are religions founded by individuals that proclaim some kind of level of, certainly of freedom from pre-existing tradition, usually an emphasis on kind of love and kindness embedded somewhere within there. At least that's what a lot of people look at. But for Jaspers, though, this also corresponded to the rise of, say, the birth of reason in ancient Greece. So it's not just a kind of a social maturation. It definitely is that, but it's also, in his view, a kind of intellectual maturation of humanity. And he even describes the Axial Age as the quote unquote, the point at which man, as we know him today, came into being, which is quite a sort of an extraordinary claim. One obviously understands what he means, the whole idea that the Greeks, are the founders of the Western tradition. That's what he's referring to. And so the term Axial Age really, it comes from the word axis, right? So it's like a hinge point. It's like the axial period in world history. It's like this hinge point from prehistory into history. History being about kind of dynamic sort of change, whereas prehistory and, indigenous or primitive or savage peoples be more about conserving the order of the cosmos. So this is a really key distinction that the axial traditions are seen to break through. This is a term that gets used a lot, a breakthrough to transcendence. The idea of moving beyond the monism of the world, a kind of a oneness with the world, represented apparently by the by indigenous religions, as they're now called, savage and primitive peoples back then, or in Jasper's language, naturfolker. So there's this distinction between kulturfolker and naturfolker. So peoples with culture, historical peoples with writing primarily, but also forms of thought and social organization that come along with writing. Versus naturfolker, on the other hand, peoples of nature who are sort of, embedded in the natural cycles of nature, the mere rhythms of nature, I think Hegel calls it, or something like that. And like Jaspers was very, very Hegelian. We'll come to that probably shortly when discussing the critique. But Hegel, over 100 years before him, as many people know, had theorized this kind of narrative of world history, the development of Geist, of spirit, of reason, and which is effectively, the development of religion as well in a lot of senses. Moving from the east over to Greece, and then upwards sort of through, to eventually to Germany, into Protestant Germany, and culminating in Hegel himself, more or less, is the impression we get. And so the Axial Age kind of reflects the point at which Geist sort of emerged in humanity. So if we follow this narrative of world history, that before, 1 or 2,000 years ago, humanity was basically a bunch of sort of animals running around, largely embedded in nature with little capacity for autonomous, self-directed change. Then the Axial Age is that period. The key difference, however, between Jaspers and Hegel is that Hegel's got a very clear hierarchy, where Greek, it starts with this really small glimmering of reason in the East, in sort of China and India, and then moving through to Greece, and then, as I said, culminating in Protestant Europe. Whereas for Jaspers, I like to say that he kind of pluralizes the Hegelian narrative, which means that instead of there being this staggered kind of revelation of Geist, in the Axial Age, once and for all, Geist kind of appears in humanity. And this was what was so crucial for Jaspers, is that it appears to have these changes appear to have taken place independently, but simultaneously. All right, so that's really, really crucial for him, because that for him is evidence that this is part of the deep nature of humanity itself. And it's important here, and we can move now onto the historiography of the period, because Jaspers publishes this in a famous book called On the Origin and Goal of History, which was released in 1949. So obviously only a few years after the war. And Jaspers, it's sort of a really, really fascinating story, and as yet largely untold, where he started to kind of work in this direction in the 1930s, but it was basically the shutdown of Germany under the National Socialists. His wife, Gertrude, was Jewish. They tried to emigrate to Oxford in 1938. That failed. And then, so they basically wound up in Heidelberg for the entirety of the war. Bunkered down, he's got health problems, they're sort of in survival mode. They have to put Gertrude into hiding a couple of times. And apparently on the liberation of Heidelberg on April 1, 1945, or whenever it was, Gertrude was literally sort of, her name was on the roster to be on a train sort of about a week later. Yeah. So her time was pretty much up. But luckily, the Yanks arrived. So in this kind of torrid time, Jaspers is sitting there reflecting. He's reading with Gertrude in their home, and he's reading the Upanishads, and he's reading. He's also reading works of Shakespeare, but he's reading the Old Testament as well, and reading things, especially Jeremiah. He talks about a lot. And I should actually just read, there's a really brief explanation of the period that he gives on the second page of The Origin and Goal of History. I've got it here in front of me, and it sort of captures everything. And he says that the most extraordinary events are concentrated in this period. Confucius and Lao Tse were living in China. All the schools of Chinese philosophy came into being. Those of Mo Ti, Chuang-Tze, Li Tzu, and a host of others. India produced the Upanishads, the Buddha, and, like China, ran the whole gamut of philosophical possibilities down to skepticism, materialism, sophism, and nihilism. In Iran, Zarathustra taught a challenging view of the world as a struggle between good and evil. In Palestine, the prophets made their appearance, from Elijah by way of Isaiah and Jeremiah to Deutero-Isaiah. Greece witnessed the appearance of Homer, of the philosophers, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Plato, of the tragedians, Thucydides and Archimedes. Everything implied by these names developed during these few centuries almost simultaneously in China, India, and the West, without any one of these regions knowing of the other. And that's, as I said before, but it's this, you can hear what he's sort of referring to there. Everything implied by these names, right? All the cultural developments implied by these names. So when he's sitting there in his, darkened house during World War II, while the Western tradition is just being sort of exploded around him, he's sitting there reflecting on all of this. And then he actually announces this in 1946 at a conference in Geneva, and he says, he kind of makes the sketch of the Axial Age argument and says that we've got we can see clearly in the traditions of humanity that we have the resources to overcome what has just happened. And that's kind of the guiding motivation. If you read the book, it's a really interesting philosophy of history. That's not really a history of the axial period at all, but it's sort of just a discussion of history framed with this at the start. So that's Jaspers. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'll sort of kind of leave him for now because just to sort of quickly skip through what happens next. Basically, in the 1960s, the idea converts into a more sociological idea, right? This is a key shift. Jaspers is very much writing in the genre of philosophy of history. The next time this concept sort of emerges is in actually a famous article by Robert Bellah in 1964 called Religious Evolution. He doesn't name the axial age, but he's very clearly referring to it. And I think he's studiously trying to avoid reference to Jaspers because he doesn't want to associate it with a philosophy of history idea. He's trying to do it from the more sort of theories of social evolution kind of perspective, led by Talcott Parsons and others. And then that leads into a bunch of sociological, comparative historical sociology style conferences. So more in the tradition of Max Weber than Hegel, for example. And actually, interestingly, Jaspers knew Weber in his life and was kind of idolized him before he died in his early years. It's a really interesting story there as well. But that sociological shift, what they start to do is actually compare sort of historically these societies that Jaspers mentioned rather than kind of philosophically. It's a key publication in 1975, I think, could be 1976, the journal Daedalus, which is the journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences or something. They run a big a special edition journal about this period. With a whole bunch of specialists from different areas. Then you get a few similar books, like multi-author books over the course of the 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s. And then, long story short, it culminates in a book that I assume that most listeners will probably have heard of by now, Robert Bellah's book, Religion in Human Evolution. And the subtitle is From the Palaeolithic to the Axial Age. So 50 years after he published the thing in 1964, he kind of comes back with this massive book that he started in 1998 when he retired. So that's the historiography, I suppose, of the period in a nutshell. It's a big nutshell, but...
Yes, quite a large nutshell. Now, just before we go on to your work on the axial age, there's a bit of talk about the second axial age and the third axial age. And I was just wondering if you could briefly run us through that.
So, yeah, they're terms that I think are very flimsily deployed, that are not really they're definitely not part of the proper sort of historical sociological discussion, i.e. the discussion of the kind of specialists. With that respect, that's usually part of the only places I've seen that notion seriously kind of floated are in fairly fluffy works that kind of talk about new awakenings in the modern age. You kind of can't really have a second axial age by definition in Jasper's sort of sense. So it's like, if anything that's a big profound shift counts as an axial age. And now that we've got this technological, like the rapidity of technological evolution, which is what the first axial age kind of was the cause of that, then we're just going to keep having all these axial ages. So for those playing along at home, don't use the term second axial age, third axial age. They're really analytically vacuous and flimsy.
Yeah, they kind of defeat the purpose of the original term and all that Jaspers is talking about, really.
Yeah.
But your work is quite a heavy critique of the axial age and everything that it stands for, particularly in a post-colonial context. So what do you think of the axial age now that you've run us through it?
So I really don't like the idea at all. I think the fact that we use this narrative is a symptom of the fact that the West still really hasn't come to terms with the history of colonialism. And that might sound like a bit of a stretch, so I can briefly try and explain what I mean. Basically, the problem with the axial age, I recall that I said that what Jaspers does is attempt to pluralize the Hegelian narrative. So that means he's trying to, it's like an anti-racist kind of approach, right, that he's trying to do. Yeah, another book that'll be famous to, or well known by most listeners, is Tomoko Masuzawa's book, The Invention of World Religions. And the subtitle, though, is particularly important there. how European universalism was preserved in the language of pluralism. So the idea being that this whole discourse on world religions, which we know kind of really kicked off after the 1950s, actually about the same time as the Axial Age narrative, it ostensibly is very pluralistic because it says, look at all the great religions, aren't they all like wonderful and equal? And yeah, but there's still a big hierarchy over those and the primitive religions or savage religions. They were only called indigenous from about sort of glimmers in the 1980s and 90s, but it's really only in the 21st century that that's become a prominent term. You still see Evans Pritchard using theories of primitive religion in 1966. Bellah refers to primitive religions in 1964, that kind of thing. And so basically it's reproducing, my key argument is that the Axial Age narrative reproduces stereotypes about the intellectual and moral capacities of colonized peoples, which are people in small-scale traditional societies, the people that fit the bill of savage or primitive, according to a Hegel or a Jaspers. So while ostensibly this is a really pluralistic-sounding narrative, it completely sort of embeds and accepts and reproduces the idea, like all these stereotypes about small-scale traditional societies, such as the fact that they don't really have reason, and then they're not really able to reflect, that they don't change as well, that historical societies change, whereas the whole purpose of traditional societies is to keep life on an even keel. And to some extent that is of course true, but I mean it's definitely not unproblematically true. And Western societies, for all of their sort of dynamism on the one hand, are incredibly conservative as well. So my concern is really with the reproduction of stereotypes. And I can try and give you like a sort of example or two. And a good way to think of it is some listeners will recall Thomas Hobbes' famous idea. We all know Thomas Hobbes' famous idea about man in the state of nature, right? The actual quote is really, really interesting, where he says, I've got it here, I won't read all of it, but he says how in such a condition there is no place for industry, there is no culture of the earth, there's no navigation, no use of commodities, no building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that's the image of traditional peoples, of the Naturvölker, right? Man in the state of nature. And it's this image, it is this kind of depiction of Naturvölker, which is carried along right through to Jaspers, and even, shamefully, through to Bellah's work in the 21st century. It's not intentional by that point at all. It's sort of intentional in Jaspers because he's mid-20th century kind of person with no real capacity to see how racist he is. But by the time we get to Bellah, the fact that it's not being challenged is a real problem. Jaspers says, for example, that pre-axial peoples, so this is the key categorical distinction, there's axial peoples and there's pre-axial peoples. Pre-axial peoples have in common a magical religion destitute of philosophical enlightenment, devoid of any quest for salvation and lacking any breakthrough into liberty in the face of extreme situations. What was later called reason and personality was revealed for the first time during the Axial Age. Now, basically, in the whole tradition that we described from Jaspers up to now, this kind of stuff has never been called into account. I've not found a single... There's Jan Assmann, who's a really interesting contributor to this debate, has one or two kind of asides. There's a few other asides, but no one has systematically gone through and looked at the fact that the whole sort of narrative of the Axial Age, which hinges on a kind of set of cultural comparisons, that there are axial peoples and non-axial peoples, that this is just shot through with embedded stereotypes from colonial discourse. I won't even read some of Hegel's stuff, but Hegel's got these like disgustingly racist comments, like really aggressively, overtly racist comments about the inability of Negroes to think, their sort of the fact that they can barely even understand that they are like a human subject. And Jaspers more or less reproduces that, and then no one really kind of challenges that later. As I say, Bellah himself is, it's like Jaspers. He's a seriously sort of committed moderate left-winger, moderate to sort of like reason. I wouldn't call him an extreme left-winger, but he's very much got a leftist streak in him. But it's just not seen. And another person is Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, who's not really, this is a point where like the historical sociology and religious studies really kind of mesh together, because Habermas's, sort of one of his most famous books was was most famous essay was The Reconstruction of Historical Materialism. And that was kind of then that was sort of embedded in his Meisterstück, the theory of communicative action, where he kind of compares, he even chapter 2 is something like a comparison of the modern mind against the primitive mind to sort of see what's distinctive about the modern mind. But again, he's just rehashing racist tropes from anthropologists and, travel writers as if they're legitimate data, as if they're like unproblematic descriptions. And he's even still doing this now. There's publications from 2013, 2014, 2015 that are clearly like echoing this language. And it's like, what hope do we have? What hope do we have when even like the leftist scholars cannot see this racist garbage just getting like structuring the whole way the conversation's happening? Whenever I try and raise this stuff at conferences, people are sort of a bit put out. They're really not that interested. I mean, a few are, but it's so sort of distressing in a way that it's not immediately obvious when you look at it, but for people who are trained in this, like your Bellah and Habermas and those kind of people, it is just kind of astonishing to me that they can't see what they're doing. So that leaves us in a really sort of interesting / tricky position where you say, okay, well, what are we gonna, there was clearly major changes that took place in this period. How do you describe them? And that's a legitimate question and a really interesting, fascinating one. But before we even get to that point, and I have like a lot of thoughts about that. The final third of the book I'm sort of working on will be an attempt to address some of that. But before you even get to those questions, we really just need a full-scale acknowledgement of just how like problematic this whole axial age story is. So my big thing, I suppose, is that we just got to stop using this term. The axial age should not have credibility. It's like world religions. You shouldn't use the term world religion if you're like analytically responsible and politically responsible. If you're aware of these issues, you should not be using those terms. It's kind of like a self-imposed constraint or something like that. I think about it a little bit like vegetarianism, right? You kind of say, right, for a set of like ethical reasons, I'm not going to consume that stuff, which means I've got to I don't even know how I'm going to eat now, but I've got to reconfigure my diet and I will not consume those things. It's a bit like that with these terms. It's like, I don't even care how I describe the first millennium BCE. I don't care how I describe these large-scale transnational kind of religions, but I'm not going to use the term world religion, and I'm not going to use the term axial age because they're bankrupt. They're like founded in kind of racial ideologies, and if you keep using them, even if you're aware of this stuff, you feed that discourse. Like we just need to like starve those terms of oxygen. Now, I don't expect that will happen at all at a broader scale, but within critical religious studies, it should happen. There should be no talk of the axial age. There should be no use of the term world religions. Like we need to kind of follow through all this critique. Otherwise, we just kind of do circles, citing Tomoko Masuzawa, Russell McCutcheon, and others, about the problematic nature of these terms, and then we just kind of keep using them or something. So, there's a few thoughts.
It's very difficult because a lot of the time when you get your students coming in first year or second year to religious studies, the term, particularly world religions, is so embedded in the way they think about the sociology of culture and humanity. And to undo that is quite dramatic for them in some ways. A lot of them wouldn't know the term axial age, but I understand from what you're saying that world religions and axial age fundamentally feed each other and are really part of the same way of thinking.
They absolutely are. I like to say that the axial age is kind of like the world religions discourse in historical form, because it is the rise of the world religions. That you're right, absolutely the same paradigm in a different kind of articulation. And you're right about the point that it gets really tricky problematizing this stuff with students in particular. So I guess we've got two different issues. One when specialists are writing for specialists, and the other is the kind of undergraduate education area. And there's lots of I suppose all the discussions about how do we teach beyond the world religions paradigm That's where all of those kind of conversations, kind of come in with relation to the Axial Age. And there's, the great book that Chris and David have sort of spearheaded, After World Religions, that is a genuine sort of attempt to try and, move the conversation forward, because it is really hard when you've got students coming in with preconceived ideas. And it's like anything where you need to deconstruct something, someone needs to understand it first. So it's kind of like if you try and problematize, the Enlightenment as not just the rise of reason, but also the rise of, the most sort of spectacular hypocrisy that the world's ever seen. That kind of point can be made fairly easily, but for students to really appreciate the stuff, it's really, really hard in the context of a few weeks of a semester when they're not there for long enough to grasp. Like, I remember it took me quite a while to properly grasp the critique. You kind of sort of can see what people are saying. The first time I read Mrs. Hour, I'm like, yeah, okay, cool. I think I sort of get that, man. But I had time to read the whole book over a few weeks as a PhD student, where it was relevant for me to understand the critique. In the context of undergrad education, yeah, it's going to be really, really tricky, I suppose. So I don't have any answers for how you should structure, certainly no simple answers for how you should structure undergraduate teaching in that respect, except to say that the book edited by Chris and David is, to my knowledge, the only one that's like a really genuinely it's the first great collection that can be pedagogically useful. There is definitely other stuff scattered around. There's a few good blogs around that talk about this stuff, but yeah, so it is very, very difficult.
Perhaps your work will become useful in teaching undergraduates. We might wrap it up there. I think we've come full circle quite nicely, but what are you up to now, where you've just got a new position at Western Sydney University, you've got this book on the Axial Age in the works. So what are you up to at the moment?
So yeah, the book would hopefully be good for undergraduate students if it ever gets written, because I got, as you mentioned in the intro, I finished in 2013 and I've basically just been teaching since then. I was doing casual teaching, and then I randomly got this lucky job to, teaching on the Master of Research. But that whole time I've had really only the 3 months of summer off, because I've been teaching so much. In the short, mid-year break, then I've had the Australian mid-year break. I've gone to a conference. So basically every year since I finished, I've had only about 3 months, and I've got like a chapter done there. But it's been a really real struggle. I can't imagine when I'll finish this book. You know what I mean? I would need 6 clear months to kind of get back into it. I've got some really good mapping done early from when I had a bit more time, but so it's a real classic post-PhD situation where you get sucked into the teaching thing, and then because you're doing that, you're not producing enough research to contend for postdocs. So if you ever go for a position with more research, everyone else who's applying has loads more research than you, and the teaching sort of matters jack all. So that's a real struggle. I really love the teaching, but that's made it really, really hard in terms of doing that transition. And now I find myself in a teaching role that's got nothing to do with what I've done a PhD in. And it's basically like teaching research methods, the new master's students, and teaching, sociology of knowledge kind of stuff. So it's really interesting, but it's just, I get this anxiety that it's slipping away, that you can hear me now. I haven't spoken about this for months or even years really, but since IHAR last August, which was almost a year ago. So yeah, I'm very lucky to have a position, but in terms of trying to follow through and get my religious studies stuff done, it's really, really tricky.
So do you have any, I guess, advice for those people who are going to wrap up their PhD soon, or in that immediate post-PhD period? Because you've been, I suppose, post-PhD for 3 years now. So
it depends what you want to do, of course. Assuming that people want to convert their PhD into a job in the religious studies field, or whatever kind of field that they're in, obviously the key is to publish. I mean, that really is the only way you're going to ensure that you can contend. I mean, there's been in the last 5 or 6 years, I understand, a real saturation of applications for postdocs that anywhere around the world now, because it's all international. There's, those alerts go around. Everyone who's kind of in that market is applying. So it's just getting harder and harder and harder. So you kind of need to be in it to win it. You never know where your opportunity is going to come. So you've just got to keep hustling and pushing. I suppose if you're teaching, then you need to still be working on, because most of us are going to wind up teaching to stay in the game, if we're lucky enough to get that work, if we kind of want to be doing that. So you need to be, it's great if you can teach on subjects in your kind of discipline. I had to teach, even before this one, I had to teach on European history and kind of sociology and psychology and things like that. It was all really beneficial for me. I feel this is all going to make the book better eventually, but it meant that I couldn't, none of it could align with what I was currently doing. I suppose the other thing is conferences. If you just commit and say, yeah, cool, I'll get you, I'll do an abstract of 150 words, and then you get it in and you're like, I've got to write the paper, then that's a really good motivator to keep pushing the work forward, to keep getting it sort of seen. These are all, there's no sort of revelations here, but that really is what it boils down to. And then it's always going to be the luck of the draw. I suppose one other thing is willingness to move. And that's something I don't have. I don't really want to uproot my life here in Sydney and go globe trotting for a bunch of reasons I won't go into, but that's not quite the game I want to play. So that drastically shrinks my options. But even so, it would be really difficult because even if I said, right, that's it, I'm happy to go anywhere, I don't have a research record for it. So hopefully I'll get there. But that's to be determined. I really do want to finish this book one day though, because I'm just so angry about the situation. I know the story, I know how to tell the story, that if I can just get the time to tell it, then it will put a resource there. I'd try and write it in a way that would be accessible to undergraduates while still being a full specialist kind of work. So
yes, well, I definitely think that your book sounds like a pivotal work that we really need, particularly to problematize the term axial age and world religions, both at an undergraduate level, a postgraduate level, and at a specialist level. We really need to be thinking about the way that we do present these ideas and manifestations of society. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that you get more time to write that book.
Thanks, Breann. It's been an absolute pleasure. I don't expect the time, but let's hope.
Okay.
Thanks so much for that, Jack. Wonderful to hear a more restrained version of that presentation. I remember in Erfurt back in August, there was a panel on the axial age. It had Jim Cox, Suzanne Owen, and Armin Gertz, all of whom have been on the RSP in days gone by, speaking, and Jack's was the final presentation, and this was on I think it was the Friday morning of the conference first session, so everyone was a little bit sleepy. And this is not to say that the other three presentations weren't interesting, but Jack came on all guns blazing, critiquing the concept of the axial age, and I thought would have been wonderful to have recorded that session. It certainly woke everyone up, but I'm glad that we've got some of that fire and that sort of well-placed critique onto the RSP now, so thanks.
Indeed, and I was speaking to Jack the other day about possibly contributing to the revamped Implicit Religion journal, which we, the Religious Studies Project, now co-produce with Equinox Publishing. I am co-editor along with Jack Laughlin, and I was speaking to Jack Tsonis about the possibility of either writing an article or possibly guest editing an issue somewhere down the line. So look out for the first revamped issue of that very soon.
Absolutely. That was Erfurt that we were talking about. Another conference was the ISKCON at 50 conference that Aled Thomas attended for us. So next week we've got a double header from Aled and a double ISKCON week. We've got Kim Knott speaking with Aled about the history of the movement and the concept. And then we've also got a roundtable with some practitioners and scholars who were at the conference as the response that week. The year's coming to an end as far as the RSP is concerned.
Yeah, there's only a few more weeks to go before our annual hiatus in the summertime. but we are all booked up. We've got all of our interviews lined up, scheduled. We're still looking for a few responses, but I want to thank everybody who responded to our recent call for new responses, new respondents rather. So we've added a lot of names to the respondent pool, which is very exciting. One of which we got an email from Race Macready, who regularly listens to the podcast whilst raising his almost 2-year-old son. And I have memories, I was going to say fond memories, but there's certainly memories of those days of producing podcasts whilst warming milk and trying to finish a PhD in the hour and a half where my son was napping in the afternoon.
Yeah, well, the RSP is your third child, let's put it that way.
It is, and in some ways it's been the least difficult child, although very demanding in terms of time.
Yeah, so we've got another 3 weeks of podcasts for you after next week, but we'll leave it to those weeks for you to hear what they are. As ever, YouTube, iTunes, Google+, Facebook, Twitter, now also on Google Play. And don't forget about our Amazon links. That's a really nice little top-up revenue stream that pays for everything. Thanks to our main sponsors, the BASR, and to NASR, and also to the Australian Association for sponsoring our mailing list, which you can subscribe to on religiousstudiesproject.com.
Very topical this week with our Australian contingent.
Exactly. Yeah, and just...
Thanks for listening, mate.
Cheers, Bruce.
Now, whackers.